Welcome back to the Timeline Astrology Podcast. Today is the 10th of April, 2021. And today is all about Jupiter in Aquarius. So Jupiter has just moved into sidereal Aquarius. This is different to the tropical zodiac you might be familiar with. That's most often used with Western astrology. And Jupiter, of course, has been in tropical Aquarius for some months now. It's actually going to soon move into Pisces. But sidereal, quote-unquote, fixed stars, the zodiac we use in Indian astrology, or what is termed Vedic astrology, is more in alignment with the actual constellation Aquarius. So tropical Aquarius is another matter. Just to highlight that difference there before I jump into this. And of course, there are some Western astrologers who actually now believe that the tropical signs should be renamed just to avoid that confusion, because there's a lot of people who get confused between the two zodiacs. Now, both zodiacs are relevant, and I look at both all the time, but I just have always studied sidereal because I've always studied Indian astrology. More specifically, that's just because my teacher was, studying Indian astrology, and she taught me. That's just to say that, because I use the sidereal, it doesn't mean I disregard the tropical, because again, I look at both. But when we look at both, we see how they play out. The tropical is the first to be experienced, and then subsequently the sidereal kicks in. And the advantage of using the sidereal is actually to be able to garner a lot of information from the more symbolic tropical zodiac and the sometimes many years, if not months, of a transit that occurs prior to it moving into the sidereal sign. We can use all of that information and bring it down into our analysis of the sidereal, and in more practical ways, in many ways, because it's aligning with the actual signs of the zodiac, the constellations. Now, it's not constellational zodiac, because you could take that another step and say that the constellations are of different sizes, because sidereal also divides up the zodiac in 30-degree segments. So, all to say that basically Jupiter has just moved into sidereal Aquarius. And I say sidereal Aquarius because I want to make that distinction. So what is Aquarius in general? Aquarius is all about the future. It's all about progress. And that has its upsides and its downsides. And Aquarius has a lot of sides, a lot of seemingly paradoxical sides to it. So on the one hand, it's all about air, because it's an air dominant sign. But on the other side, its symbol is the water bearer. On the one hand, it's all about individuality, freedom. On the other hand, it's all about humanity and equality. So there's a lot of dichotomy in the sign that needs to be understood in terms of its eccentricities. There's a lot of quirks that are expressed in Aquarius, and if you think about it, just basically down to the fact that it's got two rulers, not just one planetary ruler. There are two rulers. Saturn is one, which is all about form and structure, the rule book. And Rahu, the north node of the moon, is the other, which is all about breaking the rules, which is all about progressing things, which is all about pushing the envelope. And so in order to be able to push the envelope, to break the rules, you have to actually know the rules. So this is the whole thing about Aquarius. You actually have to know the rules to break them. And this is why Aquarius is all about doubts. It's all about our fears. It's all about uncertainty. It's all about not knowing the truth. And that's what science is all about, in fact. And I had a conversation recently with someone, a scientist, who basically stated just that. It's like science is nothing about belief. Science is all about not believing. It's about testing. So Aquarius is all about testing theories and actually trying to disprove things more than anything else. And this is again expressed through the sign and the planets that rule it, Saturn and Rahu. Rahu is quite a an interesting character in the Vedic pantheon, the Vedic gods, and the myths surrounding the planets and the gods, because it's not an actual physical entity. It's kind of like an unreality. It's a shadow. It's literally a shadow. It's an eclipse, the northern eclipse point. So it's related obviously to the moon because it's a north node of the moon. So there's a lot of kind of psychological complexity that is prominent in the sign Aquarius, as well as the more obvious structural needs of Saturn, and again progress being one of the key things of the sign. It's all about taking the more structured elements of Capricorn, which represent banking systems, government systems, any kind of system that we live our life by, and then just moving it forward. So science obviously does that always. It's all about progressing things. It's all about innovation. And so Jupiter now has just moved into this sign. And what does that mean? Well, Jupiter is all about expansion and growth. And that has been severely curtailed of late because Jupiter has been in Capricorn, where it's seen as in its fall, in its depression. So every time Jupiter goes into Capricorn, every 12 years or so, there is a depression or at least a recession. And, this is the case again. It was last in Capricorn in 2008. And then 2020, in March 2020, it moved in again. And so we have this downturn, a downturn in our mood, in our morale, in the economy, in our sense of hope and optimism moving forward. And we've all been really feeling it since March 2020 in particular. So Jupiter now has just moved out of Aquarius on April 5th into sidereal Aquarius, remember? And it will remain here until April 14th, 2022. So remain here for most of that time, at any rate, because it's going to peek its head back into Capricorn again in September, October, November. So from September 14th until November 20th, Jupiter will return to its fall, its debilitated position in Capricorn. This is mitigated by other factors, the fact that it's retrograde, so it kind of reverses certain indications, and the fact that Saturn is with Jupiter in Capricorn at that time, as it has been in the last year. But at the same time, there is a return to a downturn, a restriction of some kind in the autumn this year. So what we're having in the meantime, though, is this sense of new hope, new sense of possibility, new optimism, some sense of a light at the end of the tunnel coming in again, with Jupiter now moving into Aquarius. Now, the light itself isn't the bright light of the day, but it's no longer at least the darkness of night in Capricorn. The bright light of day comes when Jupiter moves into Pisces in April 2022. The Aquarius transit for Jupiter is like a twilight phase. It's like that transitional phase in the day at dusk or dawn, where there is this, especially at dawn, a sense of new possibility awakening in us. And I would say as well that between April and September 2021, it's a dusk period. It feels more like a dusk period because Jupiter then has to go back into the night, into the Capricorn sign. And then by November onwards until April next year, it will be more like a new dawn. There will be a sense even though it's winter time for most of us on the planet, there will be a sense in the winter of 2022 or 21 into 2022 of new hope, new possibility, new freedom. So the key word here, Jupiter and Aquarius, is freedom. Freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom from restraint, breaking things apart, moving things forward, progressing things, thinking about the future. It's all about freeing us from the shackles, really, of Capricorn. And so it doesn't mean that the shackles aren't there and the rule book isn't still there, because it absolutely is still there in Aquarius. Aquarius is still ruled by Saturn, as is Capricorn. But now we're bringing this other element of the North Node, Rahu element, that freedom-seeking element, and that very innovative, forward-thinking element. So this offers new possibility, thankfully, for something new, at least. So, pardon me if you can hear me moving around as I'm recording this. Interestingly enough, I'm feeling the need to walk around as I speak. I had this microphone, this attached microphone, and that's interesting in and of itself, the fact that I'm speaking about freedom, Jupiter in Aquarius, and, needing a bit of freedom from the desk and sitting at my computer. And again, that's the dichotomy of Aquarius. It's a fixed sign, but it's an air sign. And so how do we play with this balance of restriction and freedom? And this is very much the theme for the next year. So Aquarius, again, going back to the sign of Aquarius, it's very much about groups of people. And it's very much about networks and associations and like community-based groups. And so Jupiter is all about connection. Jupiter basically is the glue that holds everything together. So when Jupiter goes into Aquarius, of course, it's all about concerns for communities and groups and society in general even, and humanity even. And people who have very prominently Jupiter in Aquarius in their chart, who are born with that, to give a couple of examples that I highlight in the article I wrote on this on the website, is Marie Curie is one obvious example, a scientist who won 2 Nobel Peace Prizes, who was so focused on advancing medicine and so not focused on her own personal well-being and the impact of the radiation that she was exposed to. That itself highlights another theme and another paradox of the sign. On the one hand, it's about progress, but on the other hand, it's about not understanding the implications of that particular progress, because I'm sure Marie Curie in her research at the time was not foreseeing what would be the result of her experiments at the time and her scientific innovations. And this is again the dichotomy of Aquarius. It's like on the one hand it's all about safety. Saturn is all about the structure and the safety that structures give us. But Rahu is all about being very unsafe and unclear and very foggy. Rahu and the nodes, both Rahu and Ketu, North and South node, rule viruses, for example. So another key thing that we're going to obviously see in the next year is a lot of progress, both in good and bad ways, in relation to this current pandemic. So we're going to see progress in science in a big way in the next year. But at the same time, we are not necessarily going to know or realize the long-term implications of that progress. And that's another thing to highlight. And I think Marie Curie's chart really highlights that in her own life, her personal life, and in her own scientific discoveries. So another person that I highlight in the article is Leonardo da Vinci, who had Jupiter in Aquarius when he was born. So he is, of course, Leonardo da Vinci. He is probably the most famous inventor and the most prolific inventor of all time. So this is, again, Jupiter in Aquarius. Jupiter expands things. It's the biggest planet in our solar system. So wherever it goes, it expands. So Aquarius is all about forward thinking and innovation and inventions, literally. So Jupiter in Aquarius will create more innovations in the next year. Absolutely, that is the case. So Jupiter in Aquarius is like I said, Jupiter is like the glue that holds everything together. And so we're likely as well to see a lot more of like community-based, grassroots movements springing up and local communities getting together and trying to solve problems. Because that's another thing about Aquarius, is all about problem solving. So I would imagine we're going to see a lot of that as well. Another thing we're likely to see with Jupiter in Aquarius is more progress in terms of science and space exploration, for example, as well as what's going on our planet in terms of health and humanitarian crises, and crises all over the world, that which will continue, of course, and which will be very prominent and which we'll all be very focused on. And, that's going to continue to progress in, again, both good and bad ways, because it highlights the issues, it expands on the themes and the the need for the solutions at the same time. So, and of course, in terms of the pandemic, for example, more and more medicines, more and more vaccines rolling out, more and more discoveries in science in that way, and in cures and all of that, and more understanding even of viruses. That's another key thing. But at the same time, again, not knowing the consequences down the line. It's the kind of long-term consequences that could be challenging. So one of the things about Aquarius that is going to be very relevant in terms of, in a more spiritual sense, because you often hear that said about Aquarius, that it's a more spiritual sign. It's not a religious sign. And in fact, you could even say that it's an atheistic sign, because it's not about believing anything. That's the realm of Pisces. It's about proving something. And you can't prove, of course, the existence of God. And so it's all about science and, disproving certain theories more than anything. It's about our fears and our doubts that there is nothing else, actually, that this is all there is. So it's a more atheistic sign. But Jupiter is the planet of religion. It's the planet of hope and faith and belief in something that we cannot see. So when you mix Jupiter and Aquarius together, there's a bit of an issue here, because we don't have access to a blind faith. We cannot afford that actually right now, for the next year anyway, until Jupiter moves into Pisces. We cannot afford it. So we need to have faith in the numbers, in the signs. So that's another indication of Jupiter in Aquarius for the following year. So another thing that I want to highlight is, in a more spiritual sense, that Jupiter in Aquarius is called Kumbha in Indian astrology, and Kumbhaka is, if you're familiar with yoga, is breath retention. So Kumbha means pot, and Jupiter is very good at holding space, holding things together. And Jupiter in Aquarius and Kumbhaka, and the kind of holding space in our own lives, our own personal lives, for something to move through. If you think about the sign and the symbol of the two wavy lines running concurrently, it's very much about two things running in tandem. So this and that could both be true. This is the paradoxical nature of the sign, of course, but it's for our own individual selves as well to be able to hold space for two possibilities, that this is true, but also this is true. This is what is, and also this could be what could be, at least. So it's kind of like that we work with what is, but we take what is and then move it into the future to make something else. So there's always this dichotomy in the sign. Kumbhaka, and as well as the Kumbh Mela festival, because Mela means gathering. So the Kumbh Mela is the largest gathering of people on the planet, the largest spiritual gathering, where they gather at the Ganges and they dip in the holy rivers, because there's all of these mythological stories around the Amrita, the immortal nectar, the cure, and it's dropped to the earth by the gods. And there's all of these stories around the gods and demons fighting over this, and of course, and then it gets spilt and it becomes the rivers. And so all of this basically is analogous of how we, in our own personal lives and globally as, a humanity, go through these periods of churning of the oceans and the Amrita and the poisons coming up, as well as the Amrita and the cure. So, of course, when we're going through a pandemic, we're very focused on the poisons. But we are now also going to be moving into this period where we're very focused on the cure, the Amrita. And so the Kumbh Mela festival is taking it one step further into a more spiritual realm. Is about purification in a spiritual sense, not just in a physical way, but actually on the planet we need to go through this kind of purification process. So that's Kumbh Mela. That occurs while Jupiter moves into Aquarius. The main bathing day occurs then when the sun moves into Aries, which occurs from mid-April. So that's the main. So another thing I want to point out is its transit, Jupiter's transit through the different lunar mansions that are used in Indian astrology. And so it's initially in the sign Dhanishta, which is symbolized by a drum and a flute. So it's very much about music. And Jupiter in Dhanishta is very much about declarations and making a statement, and it's very much about fame as well. Dhanishta is also about hearing, and it relates to the previous sign Shravana also, where Jupiter has been in the past year. And it's very much about the ability, or in this case perhaps the inability, to be able to listen. To be able to listen and to hear the truth. And so there is this transition phase now as Jupiter goes into Dhanishta, where it's about having access to the truth, being able to hear each other, being able to listen to experts, and experts themselves knowing the truth and being able to guide us clearly. And Jupiter, of course, is challenged in that as it moves in and out of Capricorn and the sign Dhanishta over the next year. But ultimately we do get to the truth, we get to hear the truth, but there might be a lot of untruths on the way there. It then moves into Shatabishak, which is the next lunar mansion after Dhanishta. It's in the middle of Aquarius. So it moves into Shatabishak from the 21st of May until 20th of July. So just from the end of May until the end of July, those 2 months, Jupiter is moving into Shatabishak. That's very important, not only because it's a new lunar mansion, a new theme, but also because of what's happening at that time, from the end of May until the end of July. There are the eclipses. There's an eclipse in June, on June 10th. Mars is moving into Cancer, opposite Saturn and Pluto conjunction. So there's quite a lot of volatility going on in June and July in particular. And as that's going on, and Jupiter is moving through this sign, Shatabishak, which literally means 100 healers, there is going to be a lot of processing of obviously what's going on with the virus. There's going to be a lot of issues around that, around this need, and the vaccine issue is going to be obviously the most prominent, but it also means that it's going to be progress, which thankfully shows progress in terms of the vaccines, but it also shows progress in terms of the virus. So it's like this kind of like battle now that's going on between the gods and the demons. And that's going on within each of us, and it's going on globally. So this is going to be possibly a more challenging time in the year in June and July, because as that's going on, Mars is in Cancer in its fall, opposite Saturn and Pluto, and Saturn and Pluto show the continued restrictions that are in place, and Mars rallying against that. And we're going to see a lot of conflict in the world in June, July as a result. So then by the end of July, Jupiter moves back into Dhanishta, and because it's going to station retrograde on the solstice on June 20th. So Jupiter then stationing at that peak time of the year, starting to slowly move back after the 20th of June. We're going to see a lot more kind of review and reassessment of things that we thought we knew, and then we have to kind of review again. And that obviously in relation to the virus and in the cure for the virus and how it's being healed and the process we're going through in trying to heal it, all of that's going to be highly relevant. So that occurs after June 20th, and it continues to move back and returns into Dhanishta by the end of July. And then by September 14th, it will move back into Capricorn. Although it's staying in Dhanishta, it will return back to Capricorn. So that's another big shift that's happening by the end of September until the end of November, where we're likely to see again continued restrictions, possibly more lockdowns after an initial opening up and advancement in what's going on with the cures and all of that and the vaccines. But then again, by November 20th, Jupiter will move back into Aquarius. And then by the new year, it will go back into Shatabishak, the 100 healers in 2022, the beginning of the year. And I think things are really going to start progressing then, and in a big way, because then by the April of 2022, Jupiter moves into Pisces. And so things are going to really start opening up more. And then Saturn moves into Aquarius in the summer of 2022. And then those restrictions are lifted in the summer. Now, we are going to go back to some sort of sense of restriction by the end of 2022 again, because Saturn returns to Capricorn, where Pluto is. And so for the next couple of years, there is going to be some sense of restriction that we're not completely opened up and free to move and do what we want. But at least we're coming out of this pandemic, which will likely, in my estimation, in terms of the transits, will likely finish in the summer of 2022. And that is again because Jupiter is moving into Pisces and Saturn will move into Aquarius initially. So perhaps that will be a time when the WHO will actually officially state the pandemic is over, and then perhaps that there will be obviously still cases of the virus and that it becomes less of a pandemic and more of like sort of an endemic thing. If you want to have a read of the website, have a look at the article I wrote on this, Jupiter in Aquarius. I called it Freedom Seekers. I think that's a relevant term for this Jupiter in Aquarius transit. So have a look. It's timelineastrology.com. If you want to go a bit deeper with these, because I've obviously just skimmed the surface with this, if you'd like to go a bit deeper, you can become a patron of my work at timelineastrology.com or patreon.com/timelineastrology. And there you'll see there's a few tiers you can join. The $5 tier where you get like monthly forecasts and video horoscopes as well as daily reports. I write daily reports for patrons. Or you can go up in tiers and get more sort of one-to-one astrology or astrology on demand, or even mentorship if you study astrology, where I can help you with filling in any gaps you have in your knowledge. So have a look, timelineastrology.com. So that's it for now. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I wish you all of the best and all of the growth and expansion that is positive and possible for you at this time. Okay, until next time.